On a very uneventful Wednesday morning that felt almost identical to the Tuesday before it, and quite possibly indistinguishable from the Thursday that would eventually follow, a man named Leonard W. Pemberton found himself staring at the faintly off-white ceiling of his modest, perfectly average apartment, noticing for what must have been the 34th time that month a barely visible, almost politely insignificant line of paint that seemed just slightly smoother than the surrounding area, though not smooth enough to be interesting. As he slowly lifted his head from a pillow that had flattened itself into the personality of a stale pancake over years of gentle, unremarkable use, and after blinking at a pace so measured that one might assume he was conserving energy for something that would never actually happen, he sat up, letting his feet touch the lukewarm carpet fibers that had neither the softness of a new rug nor the scratchiness of an old one, but instead existed somewhere in the extremely unmemorable middle, a texture that never surprised him and never disappointed him because it carried no ambition whatsoever, much like the blinds that hung over his single window and swayed only when the slightest draft convinced them to move half an inch to the left before reconsidering and drifting back only a quarter inch, as if the air itself wasn't fully committed to the idea of motion. And after contemplating whether the temperature in his apartment felt slightly cooler or just differently neutral than the day before, Leonard stood up with the slow determination of someone who had absolutely nowhere urgent to go, shuffled 5 equally sized steps to his kitchen counter, and observed, with a level of emotional investment comparable to that of a houseplant, the exact position of his coffee maker, which sat precisely where he had left it yesterday, and the day before that, and likely the 726 days before those, prompting him to consider, though only momentarily, whether he should move it slightly to the right for variety, a thought he abandoned almost instantly because the idea created more excitement in his mind than he was comfortable experiencing before breakfast. So instead, he filled the same scratched, slightly cloudy glass carafe with water, counting each drop that hit the bottom more out of habit than fascination, before scooping exactly 1.5 tablespoons of coffee grounds, leveling them off with the same spoon he always used, the one with the tiny dent he had never bothered to fix because fixing it would require noticing it with more enthusiasm than he possessed. And as the coffee maker began its slow, almost apologetic brewing process, releasing a scent that was neither strong nor weak, but simply present, Leonard leaned on the counter with both palms flat, staring at the tiny digital clock on the machine, watching numbers change with the pace and thrill of grass growing in a shaded backyard. And he thought about absolutely nothing in particular, except perhaps the vague idea that today might be a perfectly adequate day for reorganizing the small drawer next to his sink, the one filled with rubber bands of nearly identical sizes, twist ties saved from grocery store bread bags, and a few pens that worked only when shaken in a very specific, decidedly annoying rhythm. And once his coffee finished brewing, he poured it into a plain beige mug that lacked any design, slogan, or personality, took a cautious sip that neither impressed nor offended him, and stood in the same spot for several long moments, looking at the refrigerator door, which held no magnets, pictures, or notes, only a faint smudge he had wiped halfway clean last summer before becoming distracted by absolutely nothing and deciding the other half could wait indefinitely. And after considering opening the fridge for no real reason, he stepped back, walked toward his living room, which was really just an extension of the kitchen separated only by the mental boundary he insisted existed, and sat in his chair, a chair that had once been firm but had slowly, quietly, and without ceremony sagged into a shape that accepted his body the same way a tired sigh accepts a long day. And from there he gazed at the small table in front of him, noticing the subtle, barely detectable tilt of the top right corner, a tilt so minor that only someone with Leonard's particular level of uneventful awareness would ever see it. Yet he found himself returning to this observation almost every morning, as if it held some secret meaning, even though he knew deep down it absolutely did not. And with a sip of his coffee that had now cooled to the precise temperature where one can't quite call it warm, nor decisively declare it cold, he thought perhaps he should straighten a stack of envelopes sitting at the edge of the table, envelopes he had arranged yesterday in a moment of mild restlessness, though now they appeared ever so slightly uneven. Prompting Leonard to pick up the top envelope, lightly tap its edges against the table surface in the universal gesture of trying to straighten paper, place it back on the stack, observe that very little had changed, and accept the situation with his usual calm resignation. Taking another slow, measured sip of coffee as he allowed his gaze to drift toward the window again, where the single tree outside, an unimpressive municipal planting with leaves that never quite decided if they wanted to look green, yellow, or vaguely dusty, stood in its usual position, swaying gently in a breeze so faint that it seemed to hesitate every few seconds before continuing. Much like Leonard's own thoughts, which wandered aimlessly from the idea of checking the mail, even though he knew the mail would not arrive until later in the afternoon, to the possibility of wiping the already mostly clean kitchen counter, to the extremely neutral concept of maybe reorganizing his sock drawer by shade instead of by thickness, though each idea drifted away slowly, like a balloon losing helium at a steady but unremarkable rate. And as he continued to sit, staring at nothing in particular, the minutes drifted by with such calm, such monotony, such gentle, drowsy uneventfulness, that even Leonard himself began to feel the soft pull of sleep tugging at the edges of his mind. Not an exciting sleep, not a dramatic sleep, but a quiet, creeping, extremely ordinary kind of sleepiness, the kind that settles over a person when absolutely nothing of consequence is happening and nothing of consequence is expected to happen, creating the perfect atmosphere for a long, slow blink that lingers just a little too long to be considered a blink and just short enough to not fully qualify as a nap. And the entire room, with its neutral colors, gentle hums, faint drafts, and unwavering stillness, seemed designed specifically to lull any observer, Leonard included, into a state of peaceful, heavy-eyelid boredom so strong that even the thought of doing anything more than breathing felt unnecessary. And as the house remained still, the clock ticked softly, the blinds barely shifted, and Leonard continued to sit, thinking of nothing, doing nothing, and experiencing nothing of significance, the atmosphere became so completely, utterly, overwhelmingly boring that anyone listening to this description would likely feel their own eyes getting heavier and heavier with each slow, dragging, uneventful detail that stretched on into the comfortably dull infinity of a morning that had no intention of becoming anything other than precisely what it already was.